The dirt road stretched before them, winding through the dense trees of Blackwood Forest. Mark, behind the wheel, guided the group with confidence, though the silence hanging in the air was almost palpable. Sarah, sitting beside him, watched the tree canopies that seemed to close in over them, as if the forest was waiting for their arrival. In the back seat, Tom and Lisa exchanged curious glances, but there was an underlying tension that no one wanted to acknowledge. "Do you think those stories about the forest are true?" Tom finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Lisa laughed, but the sound seemed out of place in the setting. "They're just legends, Tom. Stories to scare kids. We'll camp, have fun, and prove there's nothing special about this place," she replied, trying to sound confident. However, even Lisa, usually the bravest of the group, felt an unease she couldn't explain. As they continued along the narrow trail, the trees grew denser, blocking almost all the sunlight. The forest seemed alive, as if it were watching their every move. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but he couldn't shake the shiver that ran down his spine. Finally, they reached a small clearing where they decided to set up camp. The atmosphere was heavy, and the silence was interrupted only by the distant sounds of nature. As they unpacked their gear, Tom's words echoed in each of their minds. What if the stories are true? The forest, ancient and full of secrets, seemed to absorb the group's presence, as if it were eagerly awaiting the right moment to reveal its intentions. And so, with the camp set up and night approaching, the four friends had no idea they were about to enter a nightmare from which they might not escape. Dusk settled quickly, plunging the forest into an unsettling twilight. The small clearing where they had pitched their tents was now enveloped in shadows that seemed to move on their own, dancing to the rhythm of the wind, whispering through the trees. Mark, ever the practical one, lit the campfire, its flames casting a faint glow over the group's faces, but doing little to dispel the feeling of isolation. Seated around the fire, with their faces illuminated by the orange glow, the friends tried to ease the tension with light conversations. Tom, the most talkative of the group, began telling jokes, but his words sounded hollow, as if even he was aware of the weight in the air. Lisa, usually full of energy, was quieter than usual, her eyes scanning the darkness around them, as if expecting to see something moving between the trees. Sarah, the most sensitive to the energies around her, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves seemed amplified, as if the forest was communicating in a subtle but inescapable way. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, trying to push away the growing unease in her chest. "You've heard of the whispering legend, right?" Mark's voice, usually firm, came out in a low, somber tone, immediately capturing the others' attention. "They say that people who camp here hear whispers at night, whispers that don't come from any living being, but from the forest itself." Tom laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Oh, sure, another story to scare us before bed. I bet tomorrow we'll wake up and laugh about this." Mark didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fire. "Maybe, but just in case, it's best to keep the fire going all night." Lisa frowned. "You don't believe in that stuff, do you, Mark?" He shrugged, forcing a smile. "No, of course not, but it doesn't hurt to be cautious." Silence returned to the group as the fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. Despite the superficial conversation, the unease didn't diminish. In fact, it seemed to grow, pulsing in the air like a distant drum. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, trying to rationalize the growing discomfort. The forest, ancient and mysterious, seemed to close in around them, becoming not just a place, but a presence that, as the night wore on, became harder and harder to ignore. Night had fully fallen, bringing with it an unexpected cold that made the four friends huddle closer to the fire. The flames, once comforting, now seemed precarious, as if they could be extinguished by the slightest breath of wind. The forest's silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional crackle of burning wood and the subtle noises of distant nocturnal creatures, which seemed muffled and far away. Mark was the first to realize something wasn't right. He woke in the middle of the night with a disconcerting feeling that someone, or something, was nearby. He sat up slowly, listening intently, trying to catch any sound that might confirm his suspicion. Then he heard it. A whisper, almost imperceptible, as if an ancient, tired voice was trying to be heard through the leaves. He stood up, stepping out of the tent, his eyes scanning the darkness around the camp. The fire was still burning, but its flames had dwindled, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the flickering light. Mark held his breath, focusing on that barely audible sound. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, yet from nowhere at all. "What are you doing?" Sarah's soft voice startled him, making him jump slightly. She had stepped out of her tent and was now beside him, her face pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, trying to stay calm, but his voice betrayed his unease. Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "The whispers. They're everywhere." Before they could say anything more, Tom and Lisa emerged from their tents, both clearly shaken. "Did you hear it too?" Tom asked, his tone trying to sound incredulous, but failing miserably. "Yes," Lisa replied, hugging herself for warmth. "It sounded like someone was whispering right behind my tent. But when I looked, no one was there." The four exchanged glances, the fear now clearly visible on their faces. None of them wanted to be the first to admit that something supernatural was happening, but the reality was undeniable. The whispers weren't just the product of one or two imaginations. They had all heard them. Mark tried to rationalize, but the words came out hesitant. "Maybe it's just the wind, or animals making some kind of strange noise." Sarah shook her head. "It's not the wind, Mark. There's intent behind those whispers, like they're trying to tell us something." The tension in the air was palpable, and the group, which had started the night with confident skepticism, now found themselves confronted with something they couldn't explain. They decided to stick together, sitting around the fire, hoping that dawn would bring some relief. But as the hours passed, the whispers didn't stop. On the contrary, they seemed to draw closer, growing in strength and clarity, as if the forest itself was alive, trying to communicate a dark secret. And so, surrounded by shadows and whispers, the group began to realize that Blackwood Forest held secrets that none of them were prepared to uncover. The dawn brought temporary relief to the group, but it didn't dispel the sense of unease that hung over them. The sun barely managed to penetrate the dense canopy of trees, casting a weak, filtered light that did little to warm the environment. Even so, Mark, Sarah, Tom, and Lisa were determined to continue their exploration, hoping that daylight might provide answers to the unsettling events of the previous night. After a hurried, silent breakfast, they decided to venture deeper into the forest. The trail they followed seemed less marked, as if no one had passed through in a long time. The silence was oppressive, and even the birds, usually so present in the early morning hours, seemed to have abandoned that part of the forest. They walked for hours, dodging low branches and gnarled trees, until Lisa, who was at the front of the group, abruptly stopped. "Do you guys see that?" she asked, pointing to a tree trunk to her right. Everyone gathered around and saw what had caught her attention. Carved into the tree's bark were strange, ancient symbols that seemed more the work of a ritual than simple natural scratches. The markings were deep and meticulous, forming patterns that no one in the group could decipher. "This isn't something you normally find in a forest," Tom murmured, his skepticism from the previous night clearly shaken. Sarah approached the marks, running her hand over them, feeling the grooves under her fingers. "It looks like they were made a long time ago, but they're still so sharp." Mark looked around, his leader's instincts on high alert. If this was done by someone, It might be a sign that we're not alone here. They continued to explore the area, and with each step, more symbols appeared on the surrounding trees. Sarah began to feel a strange pull toward a specific spot in the forest, as if something invisible was guiding her. Without saying a word, she drifted away from the others, her steps leading her toward what seemed to be an ancient path hidden by vegetation. "Sarah, where are you going?" Mark called, noticing that she had wandered off. But Sarah didn't respond. She was as if hypnotized, her eyes fixed on something ahead. The others followed her, concerned, until they reached a small clearing. In the center, covered in low vegetation, was what remained of an ancient stone altar. Moss partially covered it, but it was evident that this place had been used for some kind of long-forgotten ritual. "What the hell is this?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling with fear and curiosity. Tom cautiously approached the altar, observing the remnants of candles and bones scattered around. "It looks like someone practiced rituals here. But how long ago, and why?" Sarah, still in a light trance, touched the altar. The moment her fingers brushed the cold stone, a wave of terror surged through her body, forcing her to recoil. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice laden with a fear she couldn't understand. Mark nodded, realizing that the environment around them seemed to be closing in, as if the forest was reacting to their presence. "Yes, let's head back to camp and decide what to do next. This is going too far." As they retreated from the altar, the feeling of being watched intensified. The whispers they had heard the previous night began to echo in their minds again, now clearer and more insistent. The forest was communicating something, but the message remained obscure and threatening. With each step, it became clearer that they had awakened something in Blackwood Forest, something that wasn't willing to let them leave without a price. Back at camp, the group was enveloped in tense silence. The fear that had consumed them during the exploration hadn't diminished with their return. In fact, it seemed to grow as the sun began to set again. The trees surrounding the camp, which had once seemed like mere natural sentinels, now gave the impression of being dark guardians, hiding secrets none of them wanted to uncover. The fire was lit earlier this time, as if the flames could ward off whatever was lurking in the darkness. However, the light that had once brought a sense of security now seemed powerless against what they were beginning to realize. The forest wasn't just watching them, it was playing with them. "I can't get those symbols out of my head," Lisa admitted, breaking the silence. "It's like they were a warning." Tom, who was usually the most skeptical, seemed equally shaken. "I can't stop thinking about them either. And what was that altar? Who used it and why?" Mark, trying to maintain composure, looked at the group seriously. "We need to stick together and stay alert. We don't know what's happening, but we can't let fear take over." Despite Mark's words, everyone felt the growing presence of something approaching, unseen and intangible, yet undeniably real. And then, as night finally took over the sky, the shadows began to appear. At first, they were just dark spots that seemed to move at the edge of their vision, something that could easily be dismissed as tricks of the light or fatigue. But soon, the shadows became more defined, moving quickly between the trees around the camp, as if they were lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Tom was the first to react. "Did you see that? Something moved over there." He pointed to a spot between the trees, but when the others looked, there was nothing there. "Stop it, Tom," Lisa said, trying to stay calm, but her voice was trembling. "We're all on edge. It could have been an animal or who knows what." "It wasn't an animal," Tom insisted, his eyes fixed on the darkness. "I know what I saw." Before they could argue further, Sarah let out a small gasp. "Mark, Tom, Lisa, I saw something. A shadow. It was right there, and it moved too fast to be anything normal." Mark, who had stood up, was now standing in the middle of the camp, trying to see beyond the firelight. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, but tried to remain rational. Everyone stay together, close to the fire. Don't separate, no matter what happens. But the forest had other plans. The shadows began to move more aggressively, seeming to toy with their vision, sometimes coming dangerously close, sometimes retreating to the edges of the clearing. It was as if the darkness itself was taking shape, defying logic and common sense. Suddenly, Tom stood up, his eyes wide as if he were in a trance. "There's someone. I need to go see," he muttered, before quickly walking away, ignoring the others' calls. "Tom, no! Come back!" Mark shouted, but it was too late. Tom was already disappearing into the darkness, the shadows seeming to swallow him effortlessly. Mark, Lisa, and Sarah ran after him, but when they reached the spot where Tom had vanished, there was no sign of him. Only the oppressive silence of the forest and the shadows, which seemed closer than ever. Lisa began to hyperventilate, anxiety taking over. "He just vanished. It's like the forest took him." Sarah, struggling against the fear that threatened to paralyze her, grabbed Lisa's hand. "He'll come back. We have to believe that. We have to believe that we can get out of here together." Mark, however, knew that something more was happening. Something they couldn't yet understand, but was becoming increasingly clear. Blackwood Forest wasn't just a place, it was an entity. And now, that entity was playing with them, testing their limits. They returned to camp, trying to convince themselves that Tom would return at any moment. But the hours passed, and the only company they had were the shadows, which seemed bolder, more tangible, as if feeding on the fear that permeated the air. The night seemed to drag on endlessly, each minute marked by the growing despair that hung over the camp. With Tom missing, the sense of security the fire once provided had completely dissipated. Now, the heat of the flames wasn't enough to ward off the cold seeping into their bones. A cold that seemed to emanate directly from the surrounding forest. Lisa was on the verge of a breakdown, pacing back and forth, her thoughts dominated by the idea that Tom wouldn't return. "We should have gone after him. We shouldn't have left him alone." Her voice trembled, laden with guilt and fear. "We can't just run off into the darkness," Mark replied, trying to stay calm, though he felt the panic rising in his own chest. "We need to think clearly. We'll wait until dawn and search for him in the daylight." "Wait. Mark, what if something happens to him before then? What if—" Lisa's voice faltered, unable to complete the sentence, as if saying it out loud would make the reality even more terrifying. Sarah, who had remained silent until then, suddenly spoke, her voice low but firm. "He's still alive. I can feel it. But this forest, it's testing us. It wants to divide us, to separate us. And it's working." Sarah's words made Mark and Lisa pause to reflect. She was right. From the beginning, the forest seemed to be playing with them, manipulating their fears and insecurities. And now, with Tom missing, it had achieved its first victory. "So what do we do?" Lisa asked, her eyes filled with tears, but determined not to give up. Mark looked around, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "We need to stay together, like we said before, and we need to focus on keeping the fire going. If the forest is trying to scare us, we can't let it win." They gathered around the fire, feeding the flames with more wood and keeping a constant vigil. But as the hours passed, fear became almost palpable, a constant presence they couldn't ignore. Then, without warning, the shadows began to move again, this time more aggressively, as if they knew the group was at its breaking point. They moved in circles around the camp, fast and silent, defying any attempt at comprehension. Suddenly, a distinct sound cut through the air, a snap, like a branch breaking, followed by a whisper, clearer and closer than ever before. Mark immediately stood up, his eyes desperately searching the darkness for any sign of Tom. "Tom, is that you? Answer me." But there was no response, only the distant echo of his own voice. The forest seemed to be mocking them, immersed in oppressive silence. Lisa, trembling with fear, clung tightly to Sarah's arm. "I can't take this anymore, Mark. We need to get out of here. Now. We can't wait until dawn. If we stay, we'll end up like Tom." Sarah tried to calm Lisa, though she too felt panic creeping under her skin. "Lisa, if we try to leave now, we might get lost in the darkness. We need light to find our way back." Before they could argue further, a new sound made them freeze. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from within the forest. Footsteps that didn't belong to any of them. They all turned toward the direction of the sound, their hearts racing, breath held. The shadows around seemed to converge on a single point, and the group knew that something was about to happen. What emerged from the shadows was a figure that, at first glance, looked like Tom. But there was something deeply wrong. His movements were erratic, as if he were being controlled by something beyond his own will. His face, partially obscured by the darkness, showed none of the expressions Mark, Lisa, or Sarah recognized. "Tom," Mark called, his voice hesitant, fear evident. "Is that you?" The figure stopped, its empty eyes fixed on them. And then, in a sudden, inhuman motion, it turned and began to walk back into the forest, without saying a word, without looking back. "No. Wait!" Lisa screamed, but Mark held her back, preventing her from running after him. "That's not him," Mark said, his voice firm but filled with horror. "Whatever that is, it's not Tom." Panic had fully set in among the group now. They knew the situation was beyond anything they could control or understand. And as the shadows around them seemed to draw ever closer, they all began to realize that perhaps Blackwood Forest wasn't a place they could simply escape from. The night seemed endless, as if time had lost its meaning within Blackwood Forest. The disturbing return of Tom, or whatever had appeared as Tom, had left Mark, Sarah, and Lisa on the brink of despair. Panic was now deeply rooted in their hearts, and the forest, like a living entity, seemed to feed on that fear, growing more malevolent with each passing minute. Despite their fears, the group knew they had to act. Staying at the campsite, surrounded by shadows and whispers, was no longer an option. With the fire dwindling and the sense of claustrophobia increasing, Mark made a decision. We need to get out of here. If we stay, the forest will take us, one by one. "But where will we go?" Lisa asked, her voice weak, her eyes swollen from crying. "We're in the middle of a place we don't know. And Tom, whatever happened to him could happen to us too." "We have to try to find the trail back," Mark replied, trying to sound determined, though he knew the task would be monumental. "If we stick together and stay calm, we can get out of here." With no better alternatives, Sarah and Lisa agreed, though the fear of venturing into the darkness was almost paralyzing. They quickly grabbed the essentials, flashlights, some food and water, and began to dismantle the camp with trembling hands. The silence around them was almost deafening, as if the forest was watching their every move, waiting for their next step. With flashlights in hand, the group began the journey back along the path they believed was correct. But as they advanced, something strange started to happen. The forest seemed to change around them. The path they had taken the previous afternoon was no longer recognizable. Trees appeared where clearings had been, and the vegetation became denser and more impassable, as if the forest itself was reconfiguring to keep them trapped. "This doesn't make sense," Mark murmured, more to himself than to the others. "We came this way. I'm sure of it." Sarah, walking just behind, also noticed the changes. "It feels like we're walking in circles. But what I see isn't the same place as before." Lisa began to hyperventilate again, the feeling of panic rising. "We're lost, Mark. The forest is playing with us. It doesn't want us to leave." Mark tried to remain calm, but the terror on his face was evident. He knew Lisa was right. The forest wasn't just a collection of trees and trails. It was a malevolent force, a living trap that was distorting reality around them. After hours of wandering without a clear direction, they stopped to rest, exhausted and disoriented. The physical fatigue was immense, but the mental exhaustion was even greater. The sense that they were being manipulated, like pieces in a sadistic game, was almost unbearable. Then Sarah noticed something on the ground. Small tracks, not human. They were strange, elongated, as if they belonged to something that shouldn't exist in this world. "Do you see this?" she whispered, pointing to the marks. Mark knelt to observe more closely, his face showing a mixture of horror. These tracks, they're from some kind of creature, something not from this world." Lisa recoiled, terrified. "This isn't possible. What's following us? What's hunting us?" Panic began to spread among them again, but Mark knew that giving in to fear would be fatal. "It doesn't matter what it is. We need to keep moving. Staying here will only make us easy targets." They got up and continued walking, but with each step, the forest seemed to close in more, becoming a living labyrinth, with paths that closed and opened as they advanced. The feeling of being watched and pursued grew more intense, and the shadows around them seemed to draw closer, as if they were ready to engulf the group at any moment. With the forest becoming a true labyrinth, the group began to lose hope. The idea that they might never leave, that they might be doomed to wander forever through this shifting landscape, began to settle in their minds. Then, in the distance, they heard the whispers again. But this time, the whispers weren't just indistinct sounds in the wind. They were clear words, calling their names, luring them toward a fate they didn't want to know. The forest was gaining control, and time was running out. The group continued to walk, but every step they took seemed to drag them deeper into an endless nightmare. The trees around them grew denser, the intertwined branches blocking the light from their flashlights and casting distorted shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. The whispers, once distant, now mingled with their own thoughts, becoming clearer, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to communicate directly with them. It was Sarah who saw it first. As they struggled to find a way out, she noticed something half buried at the base of an ancient, twisted tree. Her eyes widened as she realized what it was, a weathered diary covered in moss and nearly disintegrated by time. "Look at this," she called, her voice filled with urgency. Mark and Lisa approached, observing the diary with a mix of curiosity and fear. "It must belong to someone who was here before us," Mark said, carefully picking up the diary. As he opened the aged cover, the fragile pages almost crumbled in his hands. But what was written on them was still legible, though the text was faded and stained. The first entries were normal accounts from an explorer, describing the flora and fauna of Blackwood Forest, but as they read on, the tone of the writings changed drastically. The author of the diary began mentioning strange occurrences, whispers at night, shadows that moved on their own, and a growing sense of being watched. The accounts became increasingly chaotic, with the author describing how the forest seemed to be alive, manipulating paths, changing the environment, and making him lose his way repeatedly. "It's exactly what's happening to us," Lisa whispered, the fear in her voice impossible to hide. Then they reached the final entry in the diary. The words were written hastily, almost illegible, as if the author was on the brink of madness. "The forest. It's not just a place. It's a being, an ancient and hungry entity. It feeds on fear, on disorientation, and traps us here, in its labyrinth, until there's nothing left of us. There's no way out, unless a sacrifice is made. Someone must give themselves to it, must accept the fate it imposes. Only then can the others escape. But who will have the courage to do that?" After reading, Mark closed the diary abruptly, as if the mere touch of the words could contaminate them. "This can't be true," he murmured, but the terror in his eyes betrayed his words. "A sacrifice?" Sarah repeated, her mind reeling with the idea. Is that what the forest wants? Is that why it's chasing us, trapping us here? Lisa, pale as a ghost, took a step back. This is madness. We can't believe this. But what if it's true? What if this is the only way out? The group fell into a heavy silence, each reflecting on the terrible choice the diary had presented. The idea that one of them would have to sacrifice themselves to save the others was unimaginable, but at the same time, it seemed to be the only explanation for what was happening. Mark, always trying to be the leader, tried to think of an alternative solution. We can't make this decision now. We need to keep trying to get out of here. We can't give in to despair. Maybe there's another way, something the diary's author didn't discover. Sarah, however, wasn't so sure. Whatever inhabited that forest was becoming more present, more dominant, and the words of the diary echoed in her mind, resonating with a dark truth she couldn't ignore. Lisa, for her part, was on the verge of collapse. The idea of sacrificing someone, especially one of her friends, was unbearable. But she also knew that time was running out. What if we don't find another way? What if this is all the forest wants? The shadows around them seemed to draw closer, as if they were waiting for the group's decision. The whispers, now clearer than ever, seemed to encourage them to make the choice, to give in to despair and terror. And so, with the weight of what they had read in the diary pressing on their hearts, Mark, Sarah, and Lisa realized that Blackwood Forest wasn't just a place of darkness, but a test of their limits, of their humanity, and the greatest test was yet to come. The tension was palpable as the group huddled together, their minds swirling around the terrible dilemma the diary had presented. The idea that a sacrifice might be the only way out weighed on them like a shadow, each one wrestling with their own fears and doubts. The forest, now clearly a conscious and malevolent presence, seemed to press in on them, its silence more threatening than any whisper or shadow. Mark, Sarah, and Lisa stood in what seemed to be a clearing, but around them, the forest seemed to move, the branches of the trees extending like fingers, ready to grasp them. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and time seemed to drag on, each second a test of their sanity. Mark was the first to break the silence. "We can't do this," he said, his voice firm but tinged with desperation. "We can't just accept what's written in that diary. There has to be another way out." "But what else can we do?" Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "We're being cornered, Mark. The forest wants something from us, and if that diary is right, maybe this is the only way to save ourselves." Lisa, on the verge of panic, grabbed Mark's arm. "I don't want to die here. I don't want any of us to die. But what if there's no other choice?" The group fell into suffocating silence again, each struggling internally with the terrible decision before them. The idea that one of them would have to sacrifice themselves to save the others was a burden too heavy to bear, but the reality around them left no alternatives. The forest was alive, and its hunger was evident. It was then that Mark, after a long pause, made a decision that changed the course of everything. "If that's what the forest wants, then I'll be the sacrifice." Sarah and Lisa immediately protested, but Mark raised his hand to silence them. "Listen to me," he said, with a calmness he didn't feel. "I'm the leader here. I'm the one who brought you into this nightmare, and it's my responsibility to make sure you get out of here alive. If a sacrifice is needed, then let it be mine." "Mark, no!" Sarah exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. "We can't do this. We can't let you sacrifice yourself." Lisa was crying uncontrollably now, the terror in her eyes making it clear how much she feared losing her friend. "Please, Mark, don't do this. We can find another way. We have to find another way." Mark, however, was resolute. He knew that time was running out, and every passing second seemed to bring the forest closer to its sinister goal. "There's no other choice. The forest. It's testing us, and if this sacrifice is what it wants, then maybe you can escape." Before Sarah or Lisa could react, Mark took a few steps forward, placing himself at the edge of the clearing, where the shadows seemed denser and more threatening. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to summon the courage needed for what he was about to do. "Forest, hear me," Mark shouted, his voice echoing through the darkness. "If it's a sacrifice you want, then take me. But let the others go. Let them live." For a moment, everything was silent, as if the forest itself was considering the offer. Then the shadows around began to move, faster and more aggressively, surrounding Mark in a circle that seemed to close in with each passing second. Sarah and Lisa watched, paralyzed by horror and helplessness. They wanted to run to Mark, to pull him back, but they knew that any attempt to interfere could doom them all. And so, all they could do was watch as the shadows completely enveloped Mark, swallowing him into the darkness. The clearing was overtaken by oppressive silence, and then, as if the forest had finally been satiated, the shadows began to retreat, dispersing among the trees. The atmosphere, once so hostile, seemed to relax, as if a great burden had been lifted. Mark was gone. There were no screams, no sounds of struggle. He was simply gone, taken by the shadows to some fate the others couldn't comprehend. Sarah and Lisa stood where they were, unable to move or speak, the shock and pain of losing Mark crushing their spirits. But then, something changed. The trees around them began to part, as if the forest, now satisfied with the sacrifice, was finally allowing them to leave. He did it," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling but with a note of hope. Sarah, still struggling to believe what had happened, nodded slowly. "We need to go. We need to get out of here for him." With heavy hearts, but determined to honor Mark's sacrifice, Sarah and Lisa began to follow the new path that opened before them. The forest, still shrouded in mystery and danger, seemed to finally give them a chance to escape. But the memory of Mark and what he had done for them would stay with them forever. The path out was clear, but the true exit still depended on the courage that remained within them. Sarah and Lisa followed the path the forest seemed to have opened for them, moving with a mixture of urgency and caution. The darkness around them was still dense, but something had changed. The oppressive feeling of being hunted had lessened, as if the forest, now satisfied with Mark's sacrifice, was allowing them to leave. However, fear still resided in their hearts, and every shadow that danced on the edges of their flashlight beams made their bodies tense with anxiety. The silence, once filled with malice, now felt heavy with sadness. The forest was calmer, but the calm was unsettling, a constant reminder of what they had lost. The two friends walked side by side, not speaking, each lost in their thoughts about Mark and what he had done to ensure their survival. As they moved forward, the forest slowly began to open up, the trees receding and the vegetation becoming less dense. It was a clear sign that they were approaching the exit, the freedom they had lost hope of reaching. The air felt lighter, more breathable, and a gentle breeze began to blow, as if the forest was finally exhaling after holding its breath for so long. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, Sarah spotted something ahead, a clearing illuminated by the faint light of dawn. The sky was tinged with a pale blue, the first lights of day breaking over the horizon. "We're close," she whispered, not knowing if she was speaking to Lisa or herself. Lisa only nodded, her eyes fixed on the open space ahead. Every step they took was both a relief and a torment, the anticipation of freedom mixed with the pain of the sacrifice that had allowed them to get this far. When they finally crossed the threshold of the forest, the feeling of relief was overwhelming, but immediately followed by a wave of sadness. The clearing where they had started their journey lay ahead, the place where they had set up camp, still showing the remnants of the extinguished fire and the dismantled tents. It was as if they had come full circle, but the clearing now felt different. Not a place of adventure and curiosity, but a space marked by loss and sacrifice. Sarah and Lisa stopped, looking back at the forest behind them. It seemed calmer now, less threatening, as if the darkness and evil they had experienced were retreating into the depths, satisfied with having claimed another life. "He really saved us," Lisa said, her voice full of tears that she finally allowed to flow. "He gave everything for us." Sarah couldn't respond, her heart heavy with the loss of Mark and the understanding of the price they had paid to survive. She knew the scars of that place would stay with them forever, a constant reminder of what they had faced and of Mark's sacrifice. But she also knew that, somehow, he had found peace in ensuring their survival. "We need to leave," Sarah finally said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "We need to go and take this story with us, so that no one else goes through this." Lisa nodded, and together they began walking toward the road that would lead them back to civilization. The forest was behind them, watching silently as they walked away, its mission fulfilled for now. When they finally reached the road and saw the car where they had started their journey, the feeling of relief was mixed with deep sorrow. They knew that, as they returned home, they would be haunted not only by the events of the forest, but by the memory of Mark and what he meant to them. The forest had allowed them to leave, but they would carry a piece of it with them forever. Lisa looked at Sarah before they got into the car. "We're going to tell his story, aren't we? We're going to make sure no one else makes the same mistake." Sarah nodded, her gaze determined. "Yes, we will. He didn't die in vain." As they drove away from Blackwood Forest, the sun began to rise fully, bathing the world in a golden light that seemed almost irreversible, as if the darkness of the previous night was just a distant nightmare. But for Sarah and Lisa, the night spent in the forest would stay with them forever, a reminder that some places in the world hold dark and ancient secrets waiting to be awakened. And so, as they drove further away from that cursed place, they knew that, while they had escaped physically, a part of them would never leave Blackwood Forest. It would live on in their memories, in their nightmares, and in the story they would tell. A story that would serve as a warning to anyone who dared to venture into that place of shadows and whispers.